Good evening. Good evening and welcome to MIT. It's nice to see a healthy audience in place here, especially given the large number of Katrina-related presentations that have been advertised recently at BSCE and MIT. I've been told that our speaker will give a presentation that you have not heard and won't hear in the near future. I'd like to give just a few brief words of introduction before Rich Vogel gives the real introduction in just a minute or two. My name's Eric Adams. I'm from MIT and I'm part of the Freeman Committee. Other members of this committee include Pete Shanahan, Dominique Brocard, Bob Schreiber, Steve Estes Margiassi, George Hecker, and did I miss anybody? Oh, Rich Vogel, yes. And most importantly, our administrative assistant is Gail Sherman. And what we do each year, we put together this lecture on behalf of the Boston Society of Civil Engineers, and in particular the Hydraulics and Water Resources group, as well as the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering here at MIT. And we do that in honor of John Freeman, who, as most of you probably know, was a graduate of MIT. He was a world-renowned engineer, worked, among other things, on the design of the original Charles River Dam that separates on the Charles River between Boston and Cambridge. When he died, he left some money that is to be used for the education of young hydraulic engineers, loosely speaking. And one of the ways we honor this is to put on this annual lecture. We also entertain small grant proposals from students and practicing engineers, both in the private sector and the public sector, to do things that are educationally relevant. And recently, one of our members, Pete Shanahan, has put together a history of the Freeman Fund, and it includes all the grants and fellowships that the fund has dispensed over the past 80 years, and that's available on the web page, which you can access through the BSCES site. With that, I'd like to introduce Professor Richard Vogel from Tufts University, and he will make the presentation of the speaker.
Good evening. I'm delighted to introduce Gene Stakhiv tonight. My introduction might be a little bit lengthy, but well-deserved, so no apologies. He has a Bachelor of Science in Meteorology, a Master of Science in Oceanography, and a PhD in Water Resource Systems from Johns Hopkins. He is very unusual I don't think you'll meet anybody in our field like Gene. He's on the one hand authored 100 journal and conference proceedings. On the other hand, his experience primarily was in for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He spent his entire career there. For the 15 years prior to 2004, he was the chief of the Planning Policy and Special Studies Division of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, their Institute for Water Resources in Alexandria. So what did he actually do? Well, really what he did is he ran a bunch of studies which run around 15 to 20 policy studies a year on things like watershed planning and wetland evaluation, regulatory, economic, that sort of thing. Some of the major national studies that were under his purview, basically, which were either, he directed National Wetlands Mitigation Study, the National Drought Management Study, the Federal Infrastructure Study, the National Shoreline Protection Study, and a bunch of others over the years. Most anything to do with climate change and climate variability and the Corps of Engineers was either his idea or something that he conducted. And of course, he's been very heavily involved in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And he was the lead author for IPCC 2 and 3 on water resources in the water resource section. Currently, he's the co-director of a 6-year, $20 million international joint commission study of Lake Ontario St. Lawrence River water control system, there he manages over 150 scientists working in all kinds of areas like climate change, hydropower, recreational boating, navigation, hydropower, etc. Now, that's the national side of him. He's also got a pretty interesting international experience. He served as a senior advisor to water ministries across the world in Bangladesh, Ukraine, Armenia, and Iraq, and all the countries around the Aral Sea Basin. But one of the more interesting assignments, and was during just after the outbreak of the Iraq War, in April of 2003, he served as the senior advisor and interim minister of their irrigation and water resources. So basically, first thing, of course, he had to reorganize the Ministry of Irrigation and Water Resources. And it was havoc there. He had to create a new commission for sustainable water management. He created centers in the areas of marsh restoration, water control operations, hydrologic research, GIS, and environmental quality. You know, he had 18,000 employees with 11 state-owned companies and 5 state commissions he had to manage. The operation and security and management of all the dams, the barrages, the pump stations, the hydropower, the irrigation, blah, blah, blah. What I recall when he came back from that, he was telling some stories. I wish I could remember all of them, but you know, imagine a typical day, Gene going to work in Iraq, civilian sitting in an SUV escorted by military vehicles equipped with a gun, him with a gun, and hundreds of thousands of dollars of cash in the back seat because he had to pay off, basically. He had to enable him to buy back the water pumps and the valves and from the citizens, the very Iraqi citizens who'd stolen from their own, you know, from themselves just a few weeks ago in the looting frenzy. And it was in this environment which Gene led the restoration of the water infrastructure. So overall, I mean, he's confronted the social, political, economic, and technical aspects of water problems on local, regional, national, even international levels. I would argue he's had a greater impact on our nation's water resources than just about anybody I could name. I can't come up with anyone like Gene. I'm sorry. I can't come up with another individual in our field like Gene. He continues to challenge the consensus views on a wide range of fundamental water problems, including the one today, and he speaks his mind, as you'll hear. It's my honor to introduce Gene Stakhiv, his lecture on integrated water resources management amidst catastrophe, crises, chaos, and caducity.
Thanks, Rick. You went to excess. There are plenty of people that I can think of that had more of an impact on water resources in the United States, and I'll cover some of them in my lecture. Thank you very much for inviting me to this thing. You guys must have had an off day or something. The committee must have been drinking something. By the way, I'm very disappointed in this whole crowd here. I noticed there was a lot of wine and beer left. In my crowd, we drink the wine and the beer first, then we eat. You know, I'm following in the footsteps of a lot of big names here: Ippen, Harleman, Rouse, Peter Rogers. I just have Peter Rogers' book here, latest one on sustainable development. And I'll be talking a little bit about sustainable development. And he and I don't always see eye to eye on these issues, but that's what part of this business is. I like to come to academic fora to exchange ideas, to think about these ideas, because as you well know, working in a bureaucracy is kind of deadening sometimes, and we kind of tend to repeat the same thing over and over again. As far as Freeman is concerned, I didn't know anything about him until I checked the website. Later on in life, he went and got involved in the insurance business, especially fire damages and insurance, and he spent a lot of time trying to prevent fires. And if you think about it, and I'm bringing this in the context of floods here in the United States, check some information. There are 2.5 million fires every year in the United States, causing $10 to $15 billion worth of damage annually, which is double what the floods cost in the U.S. on average, and 4,500 deaths So, you know, if you're thinking of sort of a hierarchy of catastrophes, you might want to, you know, spend some time looking at fire-related damages. And Freeman spent a lot of time in this area. Anyway, let's get to it. I had something like 250 slides. I pared it down to 80, so I've got to go really fast. The first thing I have to do is because I actually had you know, my assistant secretary called me down on the carpet. He found out somewhere on the website that I was giving this talk, and he said, well, you know, make sure, because, you know, I don't want to get a call from them, hey, Gino, you know, you're doing a heck of a job here, Gino, you know. So I have to be careful about this stuff. Now this thing doesn't work here. Okay. All right, we'll use the old-fashioned method. The interplay between ideas and politicians has been going on for millennia, since the Egyptians in Mesopotamia. This is just one example, and this is a true story. Leonardo da Vinci and Niccolo Machiavelli. Leonardo comes up with this idea. This is his map, by the way. Let me see this thing here. Okay, see this big arc here? This is how big ideas are drawn on maps, you know. He was going to do an integrated water resources management scheme for the Arno River Basin. Take water from the Arno, divert it through a mountain range, through a tunnel, and do irrigation. It would be navigation. There's also a navigable channel all the way out to the sea. Flood control mainly flood control for Florence, Firenze, hydroelectric power, everything. He had everything. So anyway, by some strange coincidence, he was in the same castle with Niccolo, and he shows him this map, and he says, you know, would you help me realize my dream here? And Nicky turns to Lenny. He says, Lenny, it's a great idea, but you know, we have this war with Pisa right now. You think you could help me build a little diversion here around Pisa so that we get rid, you know, we kind of divert their water supply and we'll starve them out. So Lenny actually did design a breakwater and a diversion scheme on the canal around Pisa, and they started building it. But of course, they ran short of funds because the government of Florence, the city council, didn't appropriate enough funds to it, and the whole project failed. The remnants of that little thing, that little diversion, are still there around Pisa if you ever want to go there. The point is that there are grand schemes, and there are politicians and people, and sometimes the confluence of the two. I mean, it's rare when you have the confluence of a great scheme and great politicians. One of these examples is the storm surge protection system for Holland, and they built it to a 1 in 10,000 year return period. That's a pretty big event, almost a biblical event. It cost them $16 billion. By the way, let's see, here's what it looks like. It costs about as much as a big dig, doesn't it? I think it's $14 billion. Here's another big scheme that they're thinking about. We have several people here in the audience. I know Professor Peter Rogers is working on it, coming up with different schemes for Venice. We've got the Thames River Storm Surge Barrier. These are big, nice big projects. And then we have the New Orleans levee system. And we're doing a study trying to figure out why it sort of came out this way, and there are lots of reasons that it came out. Is there a film going on here? Okay. Again, some of the great people who have actually had an influence on me and on water resources, one of them being Arthur Moss at Harvard University, just passed away last year. And this is from Muddy Waters. One of the things that you have to realize is decisions are being made. They have to be made as we develop policy. And that's why you get these kind of, sometimes you get these not quite, you know, ideal, optimal ideas, because we're doing things on the run, just like I did in Iraq. I knew what the policy should be. I knew what the right thing to do was, but you're stuck. You have to You have to make things happen. The irrigation season is starting in June. Go fix these pumps, no matter what it costs. We've got sort of two ways of looking at the problem. One is one of your fellows here at Harvard, Stephen Gould, punctuated equilibrium. I favor the theory of incremental gradualism, which is an event happens, there's a lot of motion, there's a lot of ideas thrown out. We have thousands of people involved now with all sorts of aspects of Katrina. Very little of this is ever going to get, implemented. And the question is, how does it get sorted through? Why does it get sorted through? And what comes out of this? So we've got lots of people involved in this business of who's the ultimate decision maker, who makes the decisions, and we have, and in a democracy, we have to sort through all of these people. Let me just give you an example. Here, I'm just going to be talking, this whole thing is really only about the water part, okay? You have to recognize that FEMA, HUD, HEW, DOT, they all have their own satellites of various groups running around looking at changes, how to change public policy. We really don't interact with most of these people. And you can imagine that HUD, being the Housing and Urban Development, they're going to have a lot to say about how New Orleans develops, because most of the grants, most of the rules and regulations emerge from HUD. Our job is basically, and I'm talking about the core, we're sort of like, we're not the architects of the house, we're the plumbers. Once the architects design the house, they say, look, this is what the plumbing system should look like. We want, X number of bathrooms, we want the pipes to go here. So most of this work that we're doing here, the National Science Foundation, ASCE, all of these groups down here, basically talking about the plumbing system, which is a very small part of the larger picture of how to restore not only New Orleans, but also Biloxi, all of the other towns up and down the Mississippi, Gulf Coast, and Texas. We're focusing on New Orleans because that is the big thing, but we're also working on all of these other areas as well. Now, one of the things, so, I'll be talking mostly about this part, engineering standards, and a lot of the stuff that you've read in the press, the White House report, the congressional report called Failure of Initiative, the White House report, is about enhancing the coordination and response. And that in itself is another huge task of reorganizing all of these agencies and the liaisons among the agencies, getting them to talk. But there's a lot of other things that will be suggested and recommended as to changes about water policy, housing policy, transportation, etc. So there's this huge mass of things that are going on in the background. But ultimately, what happens is when things quiet down, I'll just give you one example. There are many examples like this. When things quiet down, after people have forgotten, you get OMB and, little congressional committees get together. Let me give you an example. Here is, over time, the OMB, the changes in the benefits computation for core beach erosion projects and what impact they have. Now, these are administrative changes. These are not changes that we talk about as part of public policy at all. Yet these have the greatest impact on the nature and the type of the projects that are ultimately selected and justified when we do our benefit cost analysis. You can see over time, storm damage reduction. So what they did was they changed the rules. OMB said, look, from this point on, you can use recreation benefits as part of your project justification, because up until this point, we were using mainly storm damage reduction benefits. So as we were building these beach projects, it was the recreation benefits that justified the project. All of a sudden, you come into this period of time, 1980, President Carter's water policy reform, 79, 78. They said, forget about it. We don't build projects for recreation. That's a local responsibility. Just use storm damage reduction benefits. The net result is that the nature of the project changed. It switched from structures, which went down, to beach nourishment, because we couldn't justify the more expensive structural project just on that one change alone. So even though all of the stuff that you're reading about in the newspapers, it all looks good, it sounds good, lots of, you know, basically steaming pots of water, boiling pots of water with nothing in them. Most of the fundamental changes deal with the discount rate, deal with these kinds of adjustments in cost-sharing rules, and what kinds of benefits you can use as part of your project justification. And these are all done in the background. These are administrative changes. These are not things that are discussed in the realm of public policy. Okay, so let's get to the hurricane. And here's one of these issues here. Right away, we get an authorization from Congress. Said here's $2.28 billion for these 3 states to provide the level of protection for which they were designed. There's no discussion about it. Now, it's natural. It's logical to go back immediately and say, look, we'll give you at least the same level of protection that you had before, because that's what politicians do. And I'm going to quibble about that. And $1.4 billion went to New Orleans, Louisiana and New Orleans. So this is the directions that we get, my agency gets. It isn't that we went to Congress begging them for $2.5 billion. They threw money at us. They have even more money to give to us. We're happy to take it, obviously. So what are we going to do for this $2.28 billion? And there's more money to come afterwards. So the first thing we do is we're going to restore all of the damaged components in pre-Katrina by June 1st. That's a big, tall order, and I'll show you why later. Because we didn't even finish the original system, and now we're going to restore and repair the entire system. We're going to restore the undamaged levees to their authorized levels. What happened was, over time, when these things were built from 1965 to 1990, they kind of sank in the peat and the mud. So there's different elevations. Many of them are 2-3 feet lower than the design elevation. There was a whole section, whole part of the New Orleans system that wasn't completed from the original authorization. So we're going to finish those by September. Additional improvements, hardening of levees, and I'll show you some pictures of what that means, by September 2007. And then there's a study going on here about higher levels of protection. You read about it in the newspaper, something like, Category 5 level of protection. And this is where I think the academia gets involved and should get involved, is how do we make the decision? What should be the level of protection? And I'll show you that there are, many uncertainties on our part about what it should be. How do you design something to a Category 5 hurricane when there are 1,000 permutations of the various hurricane sort of parameters of fetch, duration, pressure, wind speed, how fast the hurricane is moving? I mean, it's just different combinations. So, what do we select? So for this study, this longer-term Category 5 study, we've got a bunch of people. It's not the Corps of Engineers. We've got lots of help from the outside, including the Netherlands and Japan, and NGOs are working on developing it. So it isn't as if we got the sort of the business as usual, the standard procedure of just getting a bunch of good old boys from New Orleans and Louisiana from the Corps of Engineers to sit down and draw lines on a map and say, how high is it going to be? This is a fairly substantive piece of work. Here's what the levee system looks like in sort of 2.5 dimensions. It's lots of compartments. And you need to realize that a lot of New Orleans is well below sea level. So this is the riverside, and here's the Lake Pontchartrain side. Here's some of the, remember I told you there are a lot of levees that are not up to design standards because they were built and the swells in them, they sank, they settled. You can see they're 75 miles below authorized, and the flood walls below authorized. So that's something we're going to fix later on. That's the following year, right? Those parts that have not been damaged, we're going to leave them alone, but then we're going to raise them up to their authorized height, the Category 3+ height, in 2007, which will require more money. That's the $2.8 2.28 is just for this year. One of the things that, having thought about it, if this is a catastrophe, so if it's a catastrophe, what is it? What is a catastrophe? It's an event that exceeds the design standards. Now, we can argue whether this hurricane actually exceeded the design standards, and I will show you evidence why I think it did, but we can still argue about it later on because there are probably people here working on these various committees who have something to say about it. The other thing is the difference between a breach and overtopping. You can overtop a levee, you could overtop a spillway, you could overtop a dam. Doesn't necessarily cause failure. So a breach is a structural failure that can be caused by overtopping, but not necessarily. And there's a couple of reasons why we've had these failures here. And my judgment is, just looking at the information and the data, roughly 25% allocation of reasons for different failures in different places. And maintenance is one of these reasons. It's just failure to maintain the levees properly. So a couple of pictures, you've seen these things. So right now we're about 50% complete on our way to meeting the June 1st deadline, and obviously we've completed the easier parts. The more difficult ones are to be done, but you can see there's a lot of, got about 164 miles that we have to repair, pump stations, and all over the place. Let me just give you a couple other pictures here. That's why I could have 170 slides. I'm just going to be zipping through them. This is this big channel that goes all the way out to the Gulf Coast. It's really navigation. And here's the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, the infamous Gulf Outlet. You can see how much of it was damaged, because this is where you have the biggest storm surge heights, 18 to 20 feet. We're also, people forget about this, but Katrina caused a lot of sedimentation in the intercoastal waterway and all of the other navigation channels. So we're dredging these places in the various ports around here day and night. You can see that as of this is 14 November, they've gone a lot further since that time. They've opened up most of these ports for navigation. Okay, now let's get back to the evolution of the system. It was initially authorized in 1965 for $85 million, that whole system, 250 miles or so, okay, with an estimated completion date in 1979. But you have to remember, when they were designing the system, the probable maximum, or the standard project hurricane that was used for design was given to us by the National Weather Service. They did the sort of the hurricane parameters. And it was equivalent to something like a category 2+ hurricane today. So the system wasn't designed to a category 3 hurricane. It was designed to something less, because the hurricanes then were less intense and less frequent at that time. And they developed two alternatives. So the alternative one, 2 rings of protection. The inner ring around New Orleans, levees 9 to 13 feet high, and an outer, and a storm surge barrier, something like the Dutch system, at the entrance to Lake Pontchartrain. There were 2 inlets to Lake Pontchartrain with an outer storm surge barrier. Because we had a bunch of lawsuits, lots of environmental complaints, recreational, the shrimp industry, they were unhappy about the gates. It wasn't just the environmentalists. They abandoned Plan 1, including the outer barrier. They went with Plan 2, which was 16 to 18 and a half feet, which they never built. But the cost rose to $800 million by 1982, by the time they got started again, with a 2015 completion date. So the system was not completed when Hurricane Katrina hit. I mean, it has another 10 years to go. So we got about 125 miles of these levees at the higher elevations with the flood walls. And what was happening during this period of time was that the appropriations that we needed to stay on track with this schedule, we needed 15 to 20 million bucks a year to complete it. We were only getting 5 to 7 million bucks per year. So it was even stretched out further. So now what we're doing is we're doing everything that we had to do in 15 years. We're going to do it in 3 years. But that's because we're getting a lot of money. That's another lesson of public policy. This just shows you the characteristics of the hurricanes that we use as design criteria for the heights of the levees. And you can see the Katrina landfall, Category 3. You can see the statistics there and compare them with the ones that were used for the design, even though it was basically a Category 3 hurricane. But that's not what the important thing is. It's really the storm surge right here. So even though Katrina was a Category 3 hurricane, it was generating Category 5 storm surge. And that's the problem of using, you know, of designing for this, because you have different tracks hitting New Orleans at different angles, crossing Lake Pontchartrain. There's so many different variants of this. The question then becomes, to what design standard do you build this hurricane protection? And how do you analyze this stuff? How do you evaluate it? How do you make the decisions? You know, the big debate within the Corps and within all of the federal agencies, the Bureau of Reclamation, has always been between standards-based design versus risk-based design. Standards-based meaning a probable, using some deterministic probable maximum hurricane or standard project hurricane or Category 3-5 or a return period of 500 years versus a risk-based design, and select a design to minimize the risk cost. I will contend, even though, you know, I've studied the theory and I've been influenced by, you know, the Professor Rogers of the world and the Mike Fearings of the world, that risk-based design is better. The reality is it cuts out redundancy, cuts out resiliency, cuts out robustness in project design. You're really minimizing the absolute minimum of the project. So risk-based design can give you a levee in New Orleans that's a 70-year return period if the value of the property behind it is not that great. And then you have differential standards. And this is what Jerry Galloway, who was the head of the Upper Mississippi River Flood Task Force in 1993, Jerry Galloway was saying, let's just select a 500-year level of protection for all of the major cities and all of the critical infrastructure. St. Louis, New Orleans, wherever there's a fundamental flood risk, forget about risk-based design. Again, he's having a tough time selling this idea with FEMA, with the Corps, with the administration. And he's pushing it very hard. I don't mean to make fun of FEMA, but this is the most benign cartoon I could find about FEMA, because they really got caught in between a rock and a hard place. And the reason is, you know, through various reorganizations, you know, they got stuck in the Department of Homeland Security when they used to be cabinet level. You know, up in 1995, they were cabinet level, and they were finally sort of moving up in the world and getting organized. But what's the important thing here? And this has to do with whether it's St. Louis or San Francisco. If an earthquake hits San Francisco, the Prieta Loma earthquake, the state has to, there's a whole big sort of hierarchy of decision-making. And the federal role in emergency management is complementary, except in exceptional circumstances. And the governor has to request a presidential disaster declaration. The president doesn't go out on his own to request it, okay? Unless there's an attack from, you know, from outside. So what happens is, and I think this is where we get involved in sort of the ideology of this administration versus previous administrations, is that as you look through these events that happen, more and more, there are more and more federal disasters being declared, roughly 35 a year. And they're declaring disaster. You know, the salmon run doesn't go well in Colombia, in the Columbia River. It's a, federal disaster. And this administration doesn't want to open the door to having every little problem that every state has declared a federal disaster. So maybe they played hardball and they said, we'll wait for Governor Blanco to request disaster relief. And that took a little while. But fundamentally, I think that's what one of the problems was there. What FEMA does is they've got these 15 emergency whatever functions. And you can see the Corps of Engineers does the public works and engineering. And just about every agency in government contributes something. So all FEMA does is coordinate all these agencies. And just getting these agencies involved in organized and responding to these disasters, especially if the disaster occurs on the weekend, is very difficult. This is what the predicted track of the hurricane was by National Weather Service as of 11 p.m. Friday, 26th. So it's over here. This is their predicted track. And here's the actual track. And you can see how the category of the hurricane shifted. But having a Category 5 here, this is where the storm surge, and it was a fairly slow-moving hurricane. This is where all of the wind was pushing the water onshore and helped create a larger storm surge than one would expect for a Category 3 hurricane. So right now we're estimating, the White House report estimated something like $102 billion worth of damage. It's fairly vague. I have a study from the University of Maryland. They did an input-output analysis and econometric analysis. Usually the graphs that you see, I'll show you a graph here. The graphs that you see here are the direct damages. That's direct physical damages. So I gave you a different kind of a graph here. It doesn't look like the normal damage graph. On the left-hand side is the direct flood damage as a percent of GDP. And on the right-hand side is the total damage. That includes loss of revenue. That includes, jobs, businesses, everything, the whole thing. So this professor from Maryland did a input-output analysis, econometric analysis. I don't know exactly what, but these dots are his total loss, total damages, the percent of GDP. Here's Katrina. Katrina is on this graph. Let's see, total flood damages, percent of GDP. It would be 0.7. It would be about 0.5 on this side, the direct damages, 0.5%, and only 0.7% of GDP. Who knows what the GDP is of the U.S.? $13.5 trillion. So if you have $100 billion or $200 billion, it's only about 0.6%. So if you look at it in this respect, from this perspective, you can see that there's been a general decline in the flood damages. And I just noted to you that the fire-related damages in the United States are far greater than flood-related damages in the U.S. I have all of these reports on my desk, but I didn't read them until these guys forced me to. He said, give us a little briefing. So I had to read all of these reports. These two reports are mainly about the organization, about FEMA, about who coordinates with whom, about the National Response Plan, who's in charge, all of that stuff. They didn't talk anything, they hardly mention water, they hardly mention the Corps of Engineers other than debris removal, okay? So what we have, and then of course, you got a bunch of reports from CRS, which I read. You've got, and this is what we're doing right now. The American Society of Civil Engineers has a task force that's overseeing our work. The Interagency Performance Evaluation Team which is doing a lot of the forensic analysis, the National Research Council, National Science Foundation as a group out there. They're trying to figure out what went wrong, how to improve the designs. And then we have the Category 5 Louisiana study that I talked about. And then I'll talk a little bit about this group that we organized at the Institute for Water Resources, 30 outside people, professors, mostly professors, who have worked, a lot of experience in coastal Louisiana. We kind of looked ahead and said, okay, forget about engineering design. How do we do integrated water management? How do we respond to the problems of Louisiana so that when this group comes out with their report, we can sort of assess it and say that it makes sense or not, that it follows the principles of integrated water management. So officially, these three groups, these four groups here, the National Association of State Floodplain Managers, is doing a study very similar to what we just produced. They're also, sorry, different study. I'm getting all these studies mixed up. Let me start here. ASCE is part of the forensic analysis team. This is the core-led team with lots of academicians. We're reporting to the National Research Council. They're reviewing, they're providing the oversight, and all of these are congressionally authorized studies. This group over here from National Science Foundation, simply an independent group. UCal Berkeley went to NSF, give us a grant. We want to do some interesting work in Louisiana. And they are overseeing the construction of the reconstruction of the levees, they're testing the soils, they're checking to see, they're kind of monitoring to see if we're doing, you know, a fairly decent job. This group is looking at, I showed you a couple of slides of what was the history, the evolution of the levee system in New Orleans. How did it come to be what it is? And what were the flaws along the way? What were the decisions that were made? Why were they made? We have a similar study in-house. We're doing a similar study just to make sure that we understand, well, when we've got thousands of pages of stuff, technical design memoranda from 1965. Some of them are waterlogged. They were saved from New Orleans. So this group essentially is doing, we sent them all of the information, and they're doing their own independent sort of analysis of the situation. I just gave you a kind of a very quick overview of it. So here's the Interagency Performance Evaluation Task Force. 10 different groups working. I'm contributing a little to this group here, and I contributed to the other IWR report. So we're doing lots of technical work, the kind of technical work that you would like to do. And you notice that there's someone here from MIT. I wouldn't be surprised if he's sitting in the audience. He's on this big IPET task group. So we're getting lots of input from different places, different people, because this is a difficult problem. And the question becomes, okay, and I'm getting ahead of myself, is New Orleans a unique situation? And should these be lessons learned for other places as well? Or is it just for New Orleans? It's one of the sort of fundamental issues that we have to deal with. We're doing lots of different modeling, state-of-the-art stuff. Here you can see some of the storm surge heights here, 17, 18, 11, and 12. So this system was designed for 13 feet, I think, 9 to 13 feet. So some of these places were a little bit low, some were just about the right height. This is Lake Pontchartrain here. Kind of stuff that your students, you teach your students structural design, stuff I've forgotten. 2 different designs here. See this, obviously, this design here is probably 3 or 4 times as expensive as this design here. And when you do risk-cost analysis, this is what you encounter. What can you get away with? And it's a kind of a fundamental issue. And the standard risk reliability methodology that they're going through. They've modeled every one of these compartments, all the pumps, all the heights, broken it down into, you know, sub pieces, polders, and looking at the soils. This is basically a standard soil profile in New Orleans, where this was the sort of the problem area right here, this peat, the swamp marsh, and we didn't drive the piles deep enough. Although they did ultimately conclude, yes, the Corps of Engineers followed their own design standards. They did drive the piles to 17.5 feet. So different failure modes, overtopping, scour, piping, uplift, and just weak soil layers. We're also doing a very detailed economic consequence analysis, health risks, evacuation routes, you know, all sorts of economics. Here are some of the, remember, now this is for the 2007 hardening, 2007, 8, and 9. These are some of the, now this thing will be built, let me see, yeah, protection by one. We'll have, in the industrial canal, we'll have a gated structure in there, but some of the other ones are looking ahead, the Southeast Louisiana Hurricane Protection System, different types of navigation structures that can be closed as well, and hardening of the levees, and also the pumping stations. Okay, so now we get sort of to the philosophical part. What do we do with all of this information? And I think on the engineering design part, not much. That's what the engineers do. I think they'll come up with new design standards. And again, the question is it unique? Is it unique for New Orleans? And then the question becomes, how big do you build it? What is it worth? What level of protection do we provide a city like New Orleans, which is in a unique situation, a bowl, versus St. Louis, versus Boston even? And how do you make those decisions? Now, Harvard University and the Harvard Water Program gave us a lot of ideas of the basic principles that we've been using for project planning have come from the Harvard Water Program and from the 1965 Water Resources Planning Act. But it hasn't been changed since that time. A lot. Now, many of the principles are still very sound. I advocate them. You know, you have the level A, level B, level C hierarchy, nested hierarchy of river basins, down to watersheds, down to projects. And so there were rules that were developed for each one of these levels of analysis. And Peter Rogers and I worked on the NAR study, the new study, level B, a whole bunch of these level C studies as well. Do they need readjustment? Perhaps we need a new Harvard Water Program to rethink the whole issue of project planning, project justification, maybe follow some of the rules of the World Bank that the World Bank uses rather than some of the rules that we have here. Do a comparison. The EU, the EC, all of, you know, they've been working on these issues for a long time. I think somebody needs to take a good hard look. It's 40 years now. The principles and standards that evolved out of the Harvard Water Program were based on sort of a blending of three basic bodies of theory, and I put the principles and standards in here. The principles and guidelines were implemented during the Reagan period. Essentially said, forget about, well, they didn't say forget about social well-being or the environment. They simply said, maximize net benefits subject to environmental constraints. So that's why I put the principles and guidelines a little bit closer to benefit cost theory. There's been a lot of work in this field. You can see, including Peter Rogers' book over here, which the Corps of Engineers has been one of the few federal agencies that have actually followed the principles and guidelines, because the Bureau of Reclamation and Soil Conservation Service, a lot of people just so simply abandon all of these principles. We're still using them to a large extent. And what we have over time is we've been following this, what I call indicative normative planning framework that's embedded in the PNS, PNG, but we've been kind of deteriorating into what I call garbage can planning. I'll give you an example. This Lake Ontario study that I've been running for the last 5 years with the Canadians. So it's a joint U.S.-Canadian thing. So we've got lots of people come in, 150 people. No rules, no procedures, no principles for planning, no principles for evaluation. You start them from scratch. So we spent 2 years debating how we should evaluate projects. And the Canadians didn't want to use economics or benefit cost analysis at all. They simply said, let's just generate alternatives and we'll decide. Decide on what? Decide how. They didn't want to use any multi-criteria decision-making methods. They didn't want to use any optimization models. They somehow, in their heads, they knew what the right solution was. And we have 3,200 watershed councils in the United States, and all of them are doing this kind of garbage can planning without any rules, without any sort of sense of, we'll just meet, we'll get together, and we'll decide. You know, again, integrating all of this work that has evolved just for flood control, floodplain management into a new paradigm for evaluation is important. So we've got all of this literature, we've got all of these ideas, very difficult to implement them in the real world. One of the things that came out of the Galloway Commission was a piece of legislation that the Corps was successful in putting in, which basically says, you know, we're going to emphasize non-structural approaches, but Congress didn't put any money into this. So we have this authority to do reasonably good, you know, flood hazard mitigation using the principles of Gilbert White, but not a nickel has ever been put into this program, even for small projects. Now, here's where we may differ with Peter Rogers in his new book, Sustainable Development, which I haven't read yet, but we may be on the same wavelength. We generally have we in water resources have a Ptolemaic view of the world. In other words, everything revolves around water resources, all of these satellites. When in fact, you know, we're a small part of, there's a national energy policy, agriculture policy. Department of Agriculture has a $80 billion budget. The water budget of the United States, including EPA, is somewhere in the order of $13 or $14 billion maximum. Ocean policy, transportation, all of these policies need to be integrated before you can say you're doing sustainable development. Just floodplain management, you know, we spend a lot of time, like Talmudic scholars, sort of examining what the hell we should do in floodplain management, when in fact most of these other agencies couldn't care less about what it is that we do. And in New Orleans, again, HUD, HEW, EPA, DOT are the big agencies. They're the ones that are going to be defining the future dimensions of New Orleans. Our job is to protect what's in place, rather than vice versa. So the ideal is, yes, integrated water management, vertical integration, horizontal integration, multidisciplinary integration. I mean, this is the stuff that you read in the books, very difficult to achieve, because this is what it looks like in the real world. This is, if you really wanted to do integrated water management, you would have to integrate all of these policies up here, okay? All of these policies and carry all of this stuff through each one of our projects, each one of our programs, and sort of harmonize the policies of all of the other ministries and agencies. Now, in fact, they probably do a better job in the developing world, because what happens is the World Bank can come to Bangladesh or Armenia and say, listen, we want you to reorganize your Ministry of Water Resources. We want you to do the Ministry of Energy, and form a National Water Resources Council of Ministers and start implementing some of the projects and the ideas that we have. Whereas in the Corps of Engineers, when we build a project, or the Bureau of Reclamation, we don't do any institutional analysis. We never look at the local institutions and say, listen, you need to reform yourselves. You can't manage this system. If we build this project, you're incapable of managing it. We can't do that. Whereas in the World Bank and USAID, Asian Development Bank, they can. And that's a big difference in the United States. Not that I would want that, authority, but I mean, this is part of the problem. And of course, when you're looking at when you're looking at New Orleans, and you're looking just at the flood control problems of Katrina, you have to remember that this is a huge watershed. Integrated water management really means looking at all of the problems of water quality, sedimentation, nutrient loading in the Gulf of Mexico. That's what integrated water management is. Again, almost impossible to achieve, kind of a holy grail. All right, so let me talk to you about this, this group that we got together. In 1 month, they worked very hard, sat down, and they came up with 10 major conclusions. They said, look, the solution to flood control in New Orleans is not only the levees, but also preserving, restoring the coastal marshes and the resources. They provide a degree of hurricane damage protection. One of the ways of preserving the coastal marshes is you need to use the sediment a little bit better, and I'll give you an example of that. Integrate planning, investment, management decisions in a new multi-objective framework. Maybe you know, someone here from the Collegium in Boston can come up with a new Harvard water program. They had lots of plans of ecosystem restoration, $15 billion program of ecosystem restoration, but it was mainly focused on the desires of the various ecologists there, had nothing to do with storm damage reduction. So we need to reprioritize all their rankings. Which of these parcels are going to give you the greatest amount of storm damage protection? Develop a spatially explicit vision. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Here's the Mississippi River Gulf outlet. There's very little navigation going on there. This is where I'm talking out of school here. But it's still a nice sediment conduit. It's a delivery vehicle for sediment. And these are exactly the wetlands and the marshes we need to be restoring to provide that extra degree of protection for New Orleans. So instead of, you can still use it for navigation, but you can have all kinds of cutoffs here so that the water that's delivered here and all the sediment replenishes the marshes naturally. That's just one idea that this group came up with. Also, you know, restoring the sediments here, and there's a barrier chain, I forget what they're called, restoring the barrier islands there. They also said that the Dutch protection model may not be applicable. The topography, terrain isn't suitable. They're not sure that it's worth the expense. And then they said, look, you know, up until now, the people who've been making the decisions on the Mississippi River Commission, the Corps of Engineers, the usual suspects, let's use the IJC model, the International Joint Commission, the one that I've been doing the study for. An independent group, joint federal state body, should have the responsibility and physical support for making these decisions. Bring up an entirely different group, and the authorization and financing should be separate from the normal Water Resources Development Act. And then employ innovative solutions and decision analysis. And they give, you know, lots of examples. So is New Orleans a different problem set, so that if we just solve that problem there, these are not transferable lessons? Do we use risk-based versus standards-based design? Who sets the standards? Do you do the land use planning first and then you build the protection? Or do you build the protection and then fill in the land use? Well, we already built the protection. We're committed to doing that. But we're not committed to doing up to Category 5. And that'll take years before they decide on that. It certainly won't be done, you know, in the next 5 or 10 years. As I was reading the literature, I went back to some of the old literature, because there's some good ideas in the old literature. There's a fellow named Charles Perrault, wrote a book on chaotic systems or highly interconnected systems, very brittle. That's exactly what we had. We had too many agencies, too many connections. If one of them breaks, the whole system falls apart. There has to be a different way of looking at these problems. We need to enhance redundancy, robustness, and resiliency. If you read the papers of Stedinger, I'm sure they're familiar to most of you here, Fearing, Hames, etc. Risk cost analysis, in my view, not that I'm against it, but it reduces the 3 R's here. Okay? you can't have redundancy in the system if you're going to do risk-cost analysis. These guys wrote a paper in '87, Surprise in Water Resource Systems Design, and Nick Metalis, also a hydrologist formerly from the USGS, a noted hydrologist, guy who worked with the Harvard Water Program way back when, invoked this Shackles theory of surprise to differentiate repetitive acts of nature. And he was looking at random acts of terrorism. Are catastrophes such as Katrina, should they be sort of examined under a different set of theoretical rules? I don't need the theory. I mean, to me, it's common sense. We think we know what to do. You just, go out there, build it, figure out the new designs. But if you want to take a theoretical look at it, perhaps you ought to look at the taxonomy of surprises. Now, if you read through this list, you're going to find that everything that happened in New Orleans fits in one of these surprise categories. So these fellows pegged what could happen, except that they all happened simultaneously in New Orleans. Because if you have to remember, FEMA in 2004 handled 4 hurricanes in a row in Florida, and they did a pretty good job. But those are, quote, normal hurricanes. This particular hurricane sort of just overwhelmed the capacity of the institutions and everyone else to deal with it. So the question at the end of their paper was, do we minimize the likelihood of surprise or optimize the system design characteristics? Again, I would say it's kind of a theoretical issue. I've been around a long time, not since 1927, but I came into the Corps in 1969, and one of my first jobs was I was on an emergency watch for Hurricane, I forget the name of it, the one that went up the Susquehanna River in 1972. We spent 3 weeks on a cot, in some kind of a school basement, helping people out. So I understand what goes through these things. And, Yogi Berra was a great, wise philosopher, and we have to kind of sit back and figure out where are we going. Oops. Thanks. Please.
I have a question. Is Congress basically directing the Corps to build it? Are we missing an opportunity to really step back and look at the situation and think outside the box a little bit more as far as different alternatives to the situation? Say, for example, maybe moving people out of this area or parts of the population over there, or some other sort of alternatives. Are we missing that opportunity?
Yeah. I mean, you realize the pressures are from the Louisiana delegation, the Mississippi delegation, Texas, to rebuild everything as was, bigger, better, nicer, because they're not paying for the costs. The reluctance of Congress and of the federal agencies, the foot dragging, is precisely for that reason. We're not sure. So we decided, the president decided, that we'll give you the system as was better, improved. Okay, which is a fairly substantial system. Now the question then becomes how much bigger, how much larger, and that'll take a while. I almost guarantee you. I mean, it's just that's the way bureaucracies work. But Louisiana has its own commission. They have their own people, almost parallel committees working on various aspects of the stuff that I showed you, where they're looking at building the system up to encompass, the previous population, 600,000, even though the population of New Orleans has been declining for the last 2 decades. So, I mean, their sort of intention is economic development, regional economic development, and they're going to use this as an opportunity to build it up. But simply because I know how Washington works, how Congress works, it'll be a long time. I doubt that they'll ever build it to Category 5, personally.
Two things. The first is, I think I remember reading the Berkeley group that you mentioned had already, I think, released a kind of preliminary assessment in which they were critical of some of the things that were underway. Can you comment on that? And the second is, a lot was made about the absence of the Louisiana National Guard, the FEMA being shifted into Homeland Security, and a number of other things. I'm just curious, since your introducers haven't been sent over to Iraq to help with the water infrastructure there, if you think that the fact that you were reassigned to Iraq and whatever resources were devoted there may also have been a significant factor in things that might have been absent in terms of a focus in relation to what ended up.
What was the first question? I'll get to that. The other one. Okay,
the first one was the Berkeley group.
The Berkeley group, yeah. I read about it in the paper, and I also, because I have access to, lots of stuff. General Strzok, the chief of engineers, personally went and briefed the president just 2 or 3 days ago on this very issue, because this came up as a problem. And all I can tell you is he assured Bush that they were importing specifically truckloads of clay from Mississippi. I mean at great expense, because to use them in reconstructing the levee, that they weren't using just the local soils, uncompacted soils. So I mean there's a difference of opinion there. That's all I could tell you. On the second issue, no, it didn't have much of an impact, and I'll tell you why. Because the people, there were obviously lots of people sent to Iraq. The people who went to Iraq were volunteers. They weren't sent to Iraq. So everyone, people like me would just say, I want to go to Iraq for a vacation. I've never seen Babylon. I wanted to see Babylon and Nineveh. I mean, this is my opportunity to see the place. And there are thousands of volunteers from the various agencies that are down in New Orleans. So I haven't seen any difficulties there. Just people from the Corps who get bored. I mean, we have lots of bureaucrats who sit behind desks every day doing little computations. This is adventure for them, and just thousands of them they want to go to New Orleans. We had difficulty holding them back.
Well, we're very good at preparing for the last disaster, and you mentioned yourself somewhere in your talk that we haven't really got a very good idea of what other major cities or infrastructures in the United States are vulnerable to this kind of thing. Can you tell us a little bit about what you know about that? What are the other coastal cities we ought to be worried about besides New York?
Off the top of my head, I mean, I haven't. Matter of fact, the president asked the general, give me the top 10 that we're looking at risks. And I don't know what that list is. I wasn't paying any attention to that part of it. Wilmington, Charleston, the usual suspects of the hurricane tracks, but also Sacramento, because it's also in the valley there in the bowl. They also have levees. And matter of fact, Governor Schwarzenegger just wrote a letter to the president and the chief of engineers. We want you to take a special look at our levees because we don't think that they're safe, and we need to kind of reconstruct them. As part of the $2.28 billion, we also have a $30 million national levee assessment effort underway. So we'll be sending out lots of inspectors looking at all of the federal and the major non-federal levees. And developing some kind of a condition, assessment. That's the first thing you have to do, kind of figure out what are you looking for and give it some sort of a rating. So that'll be underway fairly quickly. Beck?
You're building the levees or reconstructing them to the old standards at this point. To what extent will you be able to simply augment them, or will you have to tear them out essentially and at much higher expense increase the level of protection?
You know, this is not my field. I just sit in my office and think thoughts. You know, and every once in a while I go on vacation in some interesting place. Yes, if they see they've done the inspection of the levees, and you saw that they were red and green and yellows. Some of those they'll have to take out and rebuild with, you know, new materials, and drive the piles even deeper below that peat layer, probably 20, 25 feet. Depending on where you are in the system, not every part of the system is going to get a 20-foot storm surge. So that's what the risk analysis is doing. They're looking at 1,000 different combinations of hurricanes in the future to try to figure and do a kind of a probabilistic assessment of, so what should we be aiming at? What is the level of protection? And then figuring out what the costs are. What is it going to cost us? $3 billion, $10 billion, $16 billion? You know, is it worth it then? And I mean, listen, they already have a lot of these designs. I saw some of these general design memoranda from 1970, things this thick, you know, with appendices. They went through all kinds of options. They're all in there. There's nothing new. How many different ways can you design a levee? Let's face it. You know, there's new materials, sure. They may you know, include some of the new stuff.
Is New Orleans and other areas susceptible to the type of terrorist nuclear attack where you detonate the device in water and you get a surge, and if so, do the new plans incorporate any protection against that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you would have, I think the biggest threat would be during the Mississippi River flood stage, and then you blew up one of those levees. But it's tough to, I mean, you would literally need a nuclear device to blow up one of those levees. It's hard to breach one of those. But when the Mississippi River is a flood stage, and you saw that in that little cross-section I showed you, there's a lot of water in there. Yeah.
At the authorized level of protection pre-Katrina, to what extent would restoring some of the marshlands in southeastern Louisiana buy you added protection in the future?
The storm surge models, not much. I mean, if you run the storm surge models over 50 miles of marsh, 50 miles of, and they've done this, you know, they vary the Manning's roughness coefficient, you know, to sort of replicate the 4 foot of something, or, you know, mud flats. So for every mile of marsh, or every 10 miles of marsh, I forget what it is, reduces the storm surge by a foot. I think it's 10 miles, not a mile. But obviously you get kind of into a plateau. The bigger the storm, the less effect it's to have. So restoration of the marshes would be very effective for Category 1, 2 hurricanes, less effective for 3. You would hardly note any difference in a Category 5. Just swamp the whole thing. But still, the Category 1, 2, and 3 are the most frequent ones that would hit. So it would, from an expected annual damage perspective, it would have a significant impact, but it costs a lot of money. Restoring all those marshes are going to cost more than rebuilding the levees. That's a $15 billion project. So for $15 billion, think of this is what I'm talking about, cost effectiveness. So for 15, although it has other benefits, has ecological benefits, which are worth it. But for $15 billion, you're going to cut off the storm surge maybe 5 feet, right? For $15 billion, we could build a Dutch-style storm surge barrier, okay, which is more effective. Again, back there.
Is private industry, particularly the oil industry facilities, are they doing reconstruction and improvement on their own, or are they waiting for the federal government?
No, they're doing it on their own. They're a lot quicker, more efficient than we are. They're doing a good job. They're back somewhere. I came across some report where they were about 70% of the way there, and they're also racing, you know, against the next hurricane season. So they want to get back to full production, And absolutely no money is going. Now, I say no money is going to the oil industry. I don't know what tax proposals are in front of the Finance Committee in the, in Congress. They may be giving them all kinds of, rebates and tax breaks. Who knows? But right now they're spending their own money on this stuff. And they made a lot of money during the past 2 years, so it's not that we have to worry about them. Yeah. Somewhere? Yeah.
History of the flood protection and the ecological restoration. The Corps of Engineers was obviously integral in the flood protection plan in the 70s and the two-tier system. They were also partners on the Coast 2050, the ecological restoration.
Yes.
As you say, they were sort of decoupled. The two were never connected.
They were.
You can never understand why the Corps of Engineers never connected the two. Because, as you say, they may not work for the level 5, but somehow the Corps of Engineers' own planning separated the two.
I'm also irritated about that daily. This is one of the problems of integrated water resources management, when the thumb doesn't know what the pinky is doing. Okay, and one of the reasons is that it was viewed, the marsh restoration was viewed primarily as a just ecological restoration. Had nothing to do with flood damage reduction, and it was taken over, and Louisiana had a major sort of voice in it, and all of the environmental agencies, EPA, USGS, Fish and Wildlife, so they were viewing this as their own little domain. It had nothing to do with anything else. But they were looking at some of these projects, like the Gulf River outlet, deliver some sediment for us.
I mean, it's one of the biggest frustrations,
yes,
as I see it in the review that's going on currently, is the lack of integrated plans on drawing.
Yeah.
Essentially, you're admitting now that there are thousands of integrated planning, but there was nothing prior. It seems like they're having to go from scratch to come up with the integrated plan now.
Well, if I'm looking at it, if I'm advising them and whatever little influence I have on these guys, okay, these are wonderful projects. And let's say you have 100 ecological restoration projects. Let's look at the ones that have the greatest influence on flood damage reduction. They also have ecological benefits. It may not have the same benefits as some other wonderful projects somewhere else up the coast, but let's get these in place. And I mean, everyone benefits. And not only that, it's less expensive. It's more cost-effective per unit of marsh because you have a sediment source right there. Instead of having to dredge it from offshore, bringing it in, the whole thing, if you start thinking about it, it makes more sense. And finally, people are starting to think about it. Yeah.
Is it the Gulf outlet that some people have said they believe function as a kind of a
Yeah.
funnel?
Yeah.
And if that's, I don't know what your view of that is, but if that's true, then the navigation and sediment benefits might be offset by the funnel.
No, but you put a gate on it. You put a gate on it. Keep the storm surge from going up. You saw from that picture, that was the highest storm surge, was right at the end of that Mr. Go project. So whether it did or not, I mean, I can't tell you now. They're doing all of this analysis with and without, different angles. But right now, it seems like it funneled the storm surge.
In the end, you had a slide where you analysis that had a number of surprises.
Yeah.
There's a professor at Harvard who has written a book called Predictable Surprise, and I've recently laid out. I mean, there are those who say that this was largely something that could be seen as a predictable surprise, albeit with some anomalies and very unusual things happening. Do you lean more on that these were really too many surprises happening all at once, or would it be more reasonable to agree with the people who've been saying, look, this was everybody knew this was coming, is sort of a commonplace thing that's been heard a lot?
In June of 2005, they had a simulation, Hurricane Pam. It was no surprise, okay? There were two things that were surprising. One is, you know how it is when bureaucrats get together and they had 300 of them doing the simulation. Yeah, I'll call this guy. Joe will call, Mary, and Mary's going to call this, and we know exactly what we have to do. And it's sort of a virtual simulation. When you get into the real situation, because I had to deal with this in dam safety risk analysis 20 years ago, You have this big hurricane or storm event coming in, knocks out all of the electricity, right? The fireman who's supposed to be standing there directing traffic, or the policeman, he's got a family also that's threatened by this dam failure. He's not going to be there. Okay? The whole system falls apart. So that, I'm not saying that that was a surprise that you know, the sort of this coordinated network of responses didn't work. And also the levees failed. I mean, that was a surprise. Yeah. Now, it shouldn't have been a surprise, because if we had been doing a good job sort of, I mean, we knew that some of the levees were lower, some sections weren't completed. I mean, we knew all of that stuff, but we never did a hard-nosed risk analysis, and it never became part of the FEMA flooding scenario. So in that sense, it was a surprise.
But wasn't really the biggest surprise was the failure of the drainage canals at a relatively low water surface elevation? I mean, Lake Bourne clearly blew away and exceeded the design criteria. Yeah. But I think the really tragic part was the failure of those drainage canals, that it was really a routine event for them, or it should have been.
A routine event, but you know, who knew? Who was? I think there may be two geotechnical engineers in the Corps of Engineers, okay, who retired, knew that there was this peat moss layer underneath, and you know, and nobody, because these things were done 20, 30 years ago. Just about everyone who ever built that stuff was retired.
Well, but I think the design level was supposed to be up around 12 feet, but the water level failed.
But it was coming underneath. It was undermining the levee from underneath, from seepage through the peat layer to the other side.
But I thought their design counts, they took that into account when they came up with the design memorandum.
1965 standards, ASCE, by the way. Yes.
Yeah, they're developing new flood maps in New Orleans right now, or they actually were in the process when this all happened. Do you know yet what the outcome of that flood study is? And if you're putting the levees back to the original elevations, are they going to be providing you know, protection for a 100-year storm once the maps are out?
You see, I can't tell you what a Category 3+ event is. My gut instinct tells me that it's not 300 years, it's not 100 years, it's like 30 years. We had Hurricane Betsy, Camille, and Katrina within the last 40 years. Now, yeah, they didn't exactly hit right over New Orleans, but it's pretty close. And you can see from the sort of the recent trend, we've got a study going now looking at the interaction of the El Nino Southern Oscillation, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the North Atlantic Oscillation, all of these things interacting to see if there's any kind of cycles of hurricane activity, so that we could do a better job predicting how many of these hurricanes are going to enter into the Gulf and make landfall along our coast. You know, regrettably, we don't think much about, you know, Nicaragua and Guatemala and Mexico and Cuba. Cuba gets hit every time. I mean, how do they deal with hurricanes? Nobody ever reads about it. Every hurricane passes right through Cuba, right through the Dominican Republic. Maybe we should send our engineers down there. I don't know. And our planners. Right? I think they're going to fire me for that remark.
You know, Kerry Emanuel here was just presented a study. Basically, he's saying that decadal stuff just doesn't really check out, and that it's only going to get worse. Is basically, I mean, he's you know.
I said we're looking ahead. We're looking at all of these combinations just to see if there's anything there. I'm not saying I'm not committed to it. Yeah.
No, I know, but you're right when you're talking about it. It looks like it's going to get worse. Right. And his recent stuff, you probably are.
I remember just about 10, 15 years ago, Mike Fearing and Peter Rogers came to IWR and they said, you know, the probability of 2 hurricanes hitting New England, based on, remember the hurricanes in 1955? We thought it was like a 1 in 500-year event, and they redid all the calculations and said, no, it's about a 1 in 50-year event. You need to think about those things. So now I don't know how they did it, but they did it somehow. Mumbo jumbo magic. Thank you.